Paul, we're back. How you doing today?
Doing well, man.
Good. So, we've concluded, for all intents and purposes, the series on private equity and pest control that we've been going through over the last number of weeks. But now, we've really encouraged a lot of folks to reach out to us with questions. And so I think it's a great time to go through some of the questions that we've received from, a lot of folks in the industry. What do you think about that?
Let's do this.
Yeah.
I appreciate you amalgamating these.
Yeah, a lot of great questions have been coming in, and it's really piqued a lot of interest that folks have in private equity and pest control. So one question that comes up, and rightfully so, because folks want to know what their life might look like after they're acquired or partner with private equity, is really around authority, what their employment could potentially look like, and all of the potential technical ramifications of that. So one question I'll kick off to you, Paul, is like, they want to know who's my boss? Like, if I get acquired by private equity, who do I report to?
Yeah, it's probably the number one question that I hear with these private equity deals. And Nick, as you and I discussed before, we have to think about this from either a platform acquisition perspective or an add-on acquisition perspective. Let's take Pesco, for example. Pesco is owned by Thompson Street Capital Partners. I think that business probably does about $125 million in revenue now in 2024. They started in, I'm trying to think, we did their entry acquisition. I don't even remember what year it was now. It was September, and I think it was 2022. Could have been 21, I don't remember. But since then, they've probably done maybe 15 to 20 acquisitions. So they built that out organically, but also via acquisition. And that was a business that they started with an entry acquisition. They acquired Ken Fox's business, Presto. And as you've met Ken, Ken's been on the show. He's been, I think, on The Buzz as well as on Potomac TV. Ken didn't want to work. He wanted to sell his business and move on with his life. He had a general manager that was willing to stick around. So in that particular case, what Pesco did is they acquired that as the entry acquisition. That was their first acquisition in pest. They gave the manager some equity incentives. So they said, general manager, you're going to have some skin in the game here. Ken, you're going to stay on as a consultant for a while, but then you're going to be out the door. And then simultaneously, they hired Jay Keating. And Jay Keating has also been on Potomac TV. You can look him up. Jay Keating had a career at Rollins. He came on as CEO, and they built that platform. Other folks whom you know, guys like Jacob Borg and Jared Borg, sold their business to Pesco. Jared, as a prime example, is a guy who was very active for the first few months and then effectively just took a board seat. So now he goes to board meetings. He's involved in the business, but he's not involved on a day-to-day basis. So that's one example. And these are examples when you're doing a majority or change of control transaction with a private equity firm where you're selling, 60, 70, 80, 90% or 100% of the business. It'd be very different if you were taking on private equity as from a growth capital perspective and retaining control of the business. In that particular case, let's say that you own a pest control company and you sell 40% of the business and you retain control of 60%. Well, you still control the company. And so your day-to-day is probably exactly the same on the day after the close as it was the day before the close, right? You've just taken on that capital, you got into the ecosystem, but for the most part, not a whole lot changes. It's where you see these change of control situations that things can change. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have Levine Lichtman. They bought Select Exterminating from Lloyd and Matthew Garten. That transaction took place. Man, I got to remember, we do so many of these deals, I don't remember when this even closed. I think it closed early this year, 2024, if I remember correctly. But in that particular case, Lloyd, the founder of the business, in his 70s, retired.
Yeah,
He was out the door. Matthew, his son, was the CEO of the business. He remained on. He rolled some equity into Nuco. That was a platform. They're attempting to make add-on acquisitions underneath Select. Select will be the brand. They're going to buy some companies. They've done some deals. They're going to continue to grow it. In that particular case, I think Matthew's life, I just saw him, we had a coffee at I was flying through JFK. I just sat down with him a few months ago. He's largely doing the same thing that he was doing historically, although he has a lot more resources now. He has the ability to go out, do deals. He's got an M&A team that works for him, but he's still running the day-to-day of that business. So his life hasn't changed a whole lot other than the fact that he's gotten rid of his father, who was effectively his boss as the owner. So I think with private equity transactions, I think what people should realize is you do have more flexibility with private equity firms than you do with strategic acquirers. So you can kind of chart your course. And what I always tell people is, on the one hand, you can be opportunistic and go into a process, talk to a bunch of private equity firms and kind of let them help you decide what you want to do. In my mind, the best way to do this is to say to yourself, well, I want to sell 80% of my business. I'm going to take those proverbial chips off the table today. And I want to stay in control. Like, I want to continue to run this business and I want to grow the hell out of it and sell it 5 years from now. That's what I want to do. Or I want to retire, slow down my participation, maybe be on the board, maybe own some equity, but not be particularly active in the day-to-day. And finding the right partner will go out and actually recruit somebody to replace you. So there is a lot of flexibility. I would tell people it's more on them as far as being a seller. You shouldn't allow a private equity firm to dictate. You should determine what it is that you want to do and go out and find the right partner to make that happen, not the other way around.
Exactly. That's a good point. And it's really maintaining that flexibility depending on what you want the ultimate outcome to be.
Correct.
So if you want the absolute highest dollar amount, you should be as flexible as possible. That way you don't exclude some buyers from the process that might have a different vision for you. And I also think like who your boss is and what your potential role could be is often determined on who's buying you, the size of your business, whether you're an add-on, whether you're a platform, or, since this is a private equity series, we won't get into the, strategic acquirers, but, who that buyer is and what the size and scope of your business is really determines who your boss is going to be. Right? Because if you're a smaller add-on acquisition that's the, second or third add-on after the platform was acquired, they're probably going to want you on to continue to run the business if you're willing to do it in that situation, just due to the more nascent or the newer phase of this PE roll-up in pest control. So I would think those were some other factors that would play into it.
I like what you said about if you want the highest price, you have to be willing to be flexible. It's the same thing for a man or a woman out on the dating market, right? That every time you add an and to your requirement, like the pool of potential partners decreases, right? Like you want the guy who makes $1 million a year, who's highly educated, and who's attractive, and who's this, and who doesn't have kids. Well, that pool shrinks. So I think, you have to go into it and kind of think of things that way.
Absolutely. And so another question that came in, Paul, related to this, let's call it employment factors or what your life's going to look like after you are acquired by private equity is that, folks that end up rolling equity into the private equity roll-up company, but yet they're tasked with being the CEO. Let's say they're going to be the CEO of the first initial platform. Let's say after 6 months, and this was a question that came in from a viewer, in that, what after 6 months they hate it? Like, what happens to their rolled equity? Like, what happens to any other guarantees that they might have had in terms of their salary or whatnot? I think the rolled equity piece is the most interesting or most curious portion of it.
That's a great question. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. For example, I have seen equity participation agreements that say, if you leave, we, the private equity firm, have the ability to buy you out. And here's the mechanism by which this will work. I've also seen other equity participation agreements where you can be a passive investor in the business. You could be the CEO for 6 months, decide you hate it, leave, and remain on. These are prime examples of things that you should be discussing with your partners, and you should do that early, right? You should understand very early on if you think you want to be a CEO and that you think it's possible that it might not work out, and that's always a possibility, you should raise the questions that, okay, what happens? There's certain instances. There's a pest control company that operates here in the United States. It's a private equity-backed platform. If you've rolled equity, in the equity participation agreement, they wouldn't bend on this, but if you've rolled equity and then you are terminated for some sort of cause, and the cause list is something really, some sort of malfeasance, right? You are convicted of a crime of moral turpitude, or you murder somebody. You know, there's this kind of list of things that are really not, there's no way you're keeping your job. They have the ability to kind of buy you out at a discount, right? They call it a bad leaver is what it's referred to as. And so there are these sorts of clauses. For the most part, private equity firms do not like the idea of passive investors.
Yeah.
They don't like the idea of people rolling equity and then leaving. That's not what they want. LPs don't like it. And quite frankly, it makes sense. It's not good for the business. They want people to have skin in the game and be focused on growing that equity. So these provisions do exist. But for the most part, I think private equity firms are very, very flexible. If you come on board and you give it a try, and for whatever reason, for good reasons, it doesn't work out and you're going to replace yourself, they'll often like to leave you involved, especially if you're a founder, especially if you have some board participations, especially if you're on call to help them. We see it happen all the time.
Have you ever seen the reverse, or maybe not the reverse, but let's say you have a founder who's acquired by private equity. They're doing their best. They're running the business. Maybe it's going well. Maybe it's going not so well or mediocre. Then private equity goes out. They hire a new shiny executive that's running a division of a larger private equity company. They install that person as CEO and push the founder to the side. Are there any protections there for founders in order to make sure that, you know, their investment in the rolled equity is protected, or any provisions around that you've seen?
You know, I've actually seen that very instance take place back when I worked at American Capital. We had invested in a portfolio company that American Capital owned the majority stake in that business, and the founder wasn't really performing. And so we had to have a very, very difficult discussion, because we had committed to that founder, that it was a woman actually, that she was going to continue to run that business and we were going to all rally behind her. Performance had really dipped. I mean, she got a very big check on the front end. So now she had more money than she had ever had in her life. And there were a lot of distractions. I think people have to realize that if you're running a business, and let's say that you're making, you know, $500K a year or $1 million a year, you're living a very good lifestyle. But then you sell your $100 million business and you take $80 million off the table. For some people, that can be very distracting, because now you can go out and buy the yacht. Now you can do a lot of things that, well, maybe you could do before, but you wouldn't. But now all of a sudden you got a lot of extra money to spend. So she was distracted. We had to bring in somebody to run that business, and he ultimately kind of ran her out. That was handled, I think, very professionally, because we, you know, the new CEO ran her out for good reason, which was, hey, we really need to focus on performance here, and we've got to make some very significant changes that are going to impact the business. At the end of the day, it turned out to be a success, and he ended up saving the business from her, which ultimately benefited her, because I think she owned 22% of that business, and we ultimately exited that. And I think she made, on the 22%, she made more on the ultimate exit than she did selling the 78% up front. So that 22% turned into a bigger pot of gold some years down the road. And I don't remember it being more than 2 or 3 years, as a matter of fact. So that can happen. You got to have your cake and eat it too. Or you can't have your cake and eat it too. What do you want to do? Do you want to make money? Do you want to stay in charge of the company? If you want to stay in charge of the company, then you've got to actually be creating value. And if you're not creating value, you should be very happy with the fact that you've got a good partner in there that says, hey, you're not creating value. We need to protect and preserve our investment. Let's do this and get somebody else in there. So that's a possibility.
I could see in a founder that likes to have control of the business where they're getting pushed out, but yet they still have a big economic ownership interest in that business. Do you ever negotiate, or do you see provisions that allows them to actually get liquidity on that portion of the equity roll that they still own as they're being pushed out?
Yeah, I mean, again, equity participation agreements come in all different sizes and shapes. In certain instances, it's actually encouraged. And a private look. let's say that I'm a private equity firm and I employ you, Nick, and you've been great and you're the founder and you own 20% of the business and everything's gone well. And then your performance really starts to suffer. And then I think to myself, it would be great if Nick weren't here anymore. I'm going to hire a new CEO. I would actually rather buy you out at the impaired value, and I would market to market maybe on a quarterly basis and say, hey, Nick, here's what we're marking our books at. This is what this is worth. Let us write you a check and get you out, because I fully expect if I'm doing my job as a private equity firm, that's going to be worth far more 2 years from now. So I would want to get you out. Those things are typically not negotiated in advance. Now, they can be. This is the good thing about a contract is just a private body of law, and you can contract for everything. I mean, hell, you could put in there that your wife needs to have sex with you 5 days a week, Nick, and put it right in the contract. Like, you can negotiate anything that you want.
Also, on page 5, there are some terms which need clarification.
Now, I don't know if that would hold up in the court of law, but you could literally put anything you want in the contract. So it's usually not something that's in there. There are provisions, though, like if the one that we see the most is if there's some sort of malfeasance and I have to terminate you for cause, I have the ability to buy you out. Now, I have to handle you with due care. I can't, I can't buy back your equity for pennies on the dollars. And people worry about this sort of stuff. So you do have protections in there.
Yeah, I mean, people certainly worry about it. And those are really live questions from viewers wondering about these topics as they think about these decision points in their own potential deals. The other question that came up was really around the authority that they would have as a founder who's now been acquired by private equity. So, how do you think about that, Paul? Is it, you do have a founder, their CEO, let's say they were acquired as the platform, they're working in collaboration with the private equity advisor, the firm, but ultimately, what type of authority do they have to drive the business? Or is this more of just an ongoing collaboration with the board and the private equity firm?
Yeah, I would say it's very, very similar to the capacity of a CEO in a publicly traded company that reports to the board. Usually what we see in private equity backed companies is, say you're a platform for a PE firm, you're typically having quarterly board meetings. Sometimes you're having monthly status calls on financials, so on and so forth. But you're literally walking in, let's say that you sell to a private equity fund. You're the CEO of the platform business. You are basically preparing with your team a board book, and you're going into the board on a quarterly basis and you're saying, here's our strategy. This is our corporate strategy. This is our business strategy. Here's how we're going to allocate capital. And the board gets the opportunity to drill you as a board of a publicly traded company would. And you're forging that strategy and you're defending it in front of a board. At the end of the day, it's the board's decision to help you allocate that capital and determine what the strategy should be. So I would say you should look at it in a very, very similar manner to being the CEO of a publicly traded company. The buck stops with the board. They have the decision actually to hire and fire, and they can replace you, and that's what boards do. So you report and you answer to the board. Now, if you're sharp and you can forge strategy and you can defend your position in front of the board, you should be in good shape, but you report to the board.
Interesting. Another question came in here, and I'm just going to refer to my notes to read it. It was essentially, I'm feeling burned out, but in negotiations with a private equity firm. Can I expect to have certain tasks that are burning me out be alleviated by that private equity firm? Like, I'm just thinking, human resources, back-end infrastructure, things of that nature. Or do I have overly optimistic expectations about what private equity can help me with?
One of the number one reasons people sell any company to any acquirer is that, founders start to feel like it's Groundhog's Day.
Then put your little hand in mine. There ain't no hill or mountain we can't climb.
They get tired of dealing with employees, and they get tired of back office paperwork, and they get tired of tax filings. I mean, it's a nightmare. Anyone that runs a business in the United States knows this feeling. So it's a very classic issue. Whether you sell your business to Rentokil or to Orkin or to a private equity firm, every one of them is going to have a different sort of, like, you sell to a strategic, they have a big back office function. You're not doing fleet anymore. You're not purchasing chemicals anymore. They take a lot of that nonsense from you, which is very, very refreshing for a lot of sellers. From a private equity perspective, again, as we talked about earlier in the series, two broad deal structures: minority or growth equity, majority or change of control. On a minority situation, again, you sell 40% of your business, it's pretty much status quo, and the private equity firm is going to help you invest in that infrastructure. You do a change of control deal, if you're the platform business, again, the private equity firm is not taking any of that stuff from you. They're helping to invest resources. They bolster your operations. Usually, in home services space, whether it's lawn care or pest control or HVAC, what will typically end up happening, and I can even use Select as an example, usually when a private equity firm does a platform acquisition, one of the first things they do is get a CFO. Because usually most middle market service businesses don't really have the appropriate financial management. So one of the first things that they typically will do will size up your accounting and financial systems, and they will get if you run a $50 million business, they're going to go out and find somebody who's been a CFO of a $500 million business. If you run a $25 million business, they're going to find somebody who's run a P&L for a $100 million business, and that person's going to come in there and look at all your financial systems. They're going to look at your payroll. They're going to look at everything related or touching accounting and finance, try to set processes and automate those functions. They will bring on tax people, for example. You might be doing, if you're a small business owner, you're doing way more bookkeeping and tax and crap in-house than you should be. So they're going to set you up with the right firms. They're going to help you select those firms. And quite frankly, their other portfolio companies might already be working with a lot of these people. So I think there's the ability, what I hear from sellers who've sold to private equity firms, it's not an overnight switch like when you sell to Rentokil. I sell to Rentokil on September 1. By October 1st, they're already doing fleet purchasing and chemical purchasing, and they're running the payroll system. I don't have to get into a payroll system anymore. They're doing all that. That's not the case with private equity. But over time, they help you build your internal systems. And you can identify the things that are actually burning you out to make sure that you have the support and you can hire those resources. So yes, I would say that does happen, and it needs to happen in order for you to concentrate on what it is that you do well.
Okay, great. That's helpful. So those are the main questions that we received as it relates to sort of employment matters, authority, how my actual day-to-day life might change by being acquired by a private equity firm. Is there anything else that you would add, Paul, or any other questions along those lines that you've seen over time?
No, I just want to reiterate one of the points that you made, Nick. I think sellers really need to think about what it is that they want to, what objectives they want to accomplish. If it's really just maximizing purchase price, you really have to be very flexible with regard to the partners that you talk to. If you've got a game plan in your mind, which is hey, I've been at this for 20 years in this business, and I maybe have 5 years left. I'd like to diversify my risk a little bit, take some money out of my business, redeploy it elsewhere. That actually allows me to have some diversification in my life. I don't have all my eggs in one basket. And I have some significant plans of things that I think I could do with this business. And if I had a financial partner with deep pockets and the willingness to really push hard and grow, I'll be able to double or triple this business in the next 5 years. If you can kind of think about your plan, it allows you'll have a much easier time executing a transaction, and you're more likely to execute a transaction with the party that you actually would like to do the deal with. Because I find that in this current market, there are literally hundreds of private equity firms looking at pest control, hundreds. And anytime we go to a process, we're talking to 50, 60, sometimes 70 of these things. And if you go into it kind of hey, let me just see what happens, it becomes a very, very difficult decision-making process. It's better, like, look, you don't need to know exactly what you want to do, but when we start a process, I sit down with clients and say, listen, we need to figure out, number one, what our objectives are. And number two, what are the criteria by which we are going to measure private equity firms? Because they're all going to tell you the same thing. Right? They're all going to say, hey, listen, we've got a great track record. We're easy to get along with. We've got access to capital. We've got an ecosystem. We've got all of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So if you can identify your strengths, the strengths in your business, the strengths and the weaknesses in your business, as well as your personal strengths and weaknesses and the resources you require to really grow the business, you can sit down and eliminate. It's a process of elimination. If you tell these guys, here's what's on offer from me, here's what I'm looking for, it's way easier for them to eliminate themselves. Saying, hey, you got a great business, but that's not for us. Now you've got a much smaller, very hotly selected group of people that you can dig very deeply in and very early conversations about, like, hey, what happens if I partner with you guys and a year into this doesn't work? How do I get out? You know, will you replace me? What's the board look like? You can have very, very good conversations early as opposed to dragging this out, trying to figure it out over a long period of time. So that's really all I'd have to add. I know you got a ton of questions over there, and you've kind of batched these. So what's the next topic we're going to get into for the next episode, Nick?
So the next topic that I think would be helpful to talk about is rolled equity and the various circumstances around rolled equity, the value of rolled equity, the decision on how much equity to roll. You know, the nature of the question is there's a large batch around those as well.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. Talk to you soon.